She was left broken at the Galactic Auction. But one man paid the price no one else dared. Welcome back to Sci-Fi Nebula. Tonight, we slip past the bright lanes of lawful space into the rusted outskirts, where miners trade ore, raiders trade blood, and the wealthy trade lives they never planned to keep. The auction had ended. The crowd had turned away. Only one woman remained on the platform, beaten, silent, unsold. And only one man stepped forward. This isn't a tale about saviors. It's about choices, the kind that cost more than money. Chapter 1, The Auction of Shadows. Graven's Hollow wasn't a city so much as a scar in orbit, a ring of bolted halves and cargo spines grafted around a mined-out moonlet, lit by feverish neon. The Hollow's market was where star junk went to die and darker things came to be bought. Rust steamed from coolant vents. Hollow signs flickered in cold colors. Air recyclers coughed ozone and old smoke. Kade Veynor threaded through the crowd like a man unwilling to be noticed. He wore the coal-black coat of a long-haul hauler, collar up against the industrial chill, the fabric scuffed from a hard life and harder exits. His face kept the calm of someone who knew how to wait, how to watch, and, when the moment came, how to move. He hadn't come for this. He had come for seals, 24 gasket rings for a leaky scrubber bank on his ship, the Ardent. He had a list in his head and a time window in his bones. Fuel cost more here every week. Passing ships were getting stopped more often in the drift corridors for inspection fees. A man could vanish into this place if he wasn't careful. Kade was careful. So when the noise swelled behind the salvage stalls, laughter jagged and too loud, he told himself to keep walking. He shouldered past a stack of cracked cargo crates, ignored a vendor hawking bootleg medgel, and kept to his line. The list. The seals. Back to the berth. Burn out on the hour. Then the laughter turned mean. Kade paused. He knew that sound. He'd heard it on mining platforms when a green hand got backed into a corner. He'd heard it when security boys wanted a fight they could win. It was the sound of people who thought they weren't going to pay for what came next. One glance. He told himself that as he angled toward the noise. One glance and then the seals. The crowd thinned behind the saloon node. What had been shouting was now a familiar hush, something ugly finished, the participants satisfied, the spectators already bored. A pallet of crates had been bolted into a platform. A portable lumen hung overhead, throwing bluish light over a boxy kiosk where a registrar sat blinking at a flex screen, tallying transactions. On the platform, the stains of a transaction that wasn't or salvage. 6 figures had stood there earlier. You could tell by the rope marks scorched into the metal and the slick darkness drying between the seams. Now there was only one. She was young. Maybe mid-20s by human standards. Not purely human, though, there were markers in the lines of her face, the faint lit tracery beneath her skin, the slight slant in her pupils that caught the lumen and returned it in a milky sheen. Half alien, Kade thought, or gene-modded in a lab that didn't bother with paperwork. Her dress was a counterfeit of native cloth, cheap synth fiber, badly cut, torn low where hands had tugged too hard. One arm wrapped her ribs like she was holding a cracked hull together from the inside. Her bare feet were red from the cold plating. A restraining cuff ringed her left wrist, biting bruises into skin already dusted with old ones. Her hair hung in matted ropes, ferric dust clinging to it like glitter. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She wasn't looking anywhere, not really. Her eyes were fixed on a point deep in the air, as if focusing on nothing hurt less. The registrar man, thin, with the grin of a person who bit his nails bleeding and then smiled anyway, saw Kade's pause and pounced. Last lot, he sang, mock cheerful. Damaged goods, but lively. End of auction discount. Kade didn't move. His coat hid the extension of muscle in his shoulders, the way he set his stance like a man bracing against recoil. He kept his face blank and let his attention fall to the edges, a bored guard with a shock baton, 2 miners still hanging to see if a miracle of entertainment would occur, the lumens hum high enough to fuzz the audio pickups. The registrar knocked the cuff with a knuckle, metal to metal. 500 cred bits, he said. Or best offer. She's tagged in the ledger. Clean transfer. She flinched at the knock. Only that. Not the voice, not the price. Just the metal. Kade looked at her. Really looked, which most people here avoided, because looking made it real, and real meant responsibility. He saw fear. He also saw something under it, stubbornness, scorched and blackened but not extinguished. She was still on her feet when others wouldn't be. She'd held the line inside herself, even if only a thread. He could walk. He could cut sideways to the gasket stall and buy his seals and fly the Ardent into the quiet where nobody asked questions. He could forget the eyes and the cuff and the registrar's grin. 400, the registrar tried, sensing hesitation in a man whose face said nothing. Hell, I'll throw in a med strip. Kade lifted his gaze from the cuff to the man's face. Unlock her. After the transfer, the registrar replied, sweet as toxic candy. Kade drew a soft, worn pouch from his inside pocket. No flex chits, no digital handshake. Hard coin. The man's eyes lit the way predators' eyes light when prey limps. Kade dropped the pouch into the registrar's palm. The weight thumped in a way that stilled the air around them. The registrar glanced at the back room where a figure watched from shadow, owner, muscle, both, and, getting no objection, flicked his wrist. The cuff hissed. Metal loosened. It clattered open and fell to the deck. She didn't run. She didn't move. She swayed once, corrected. The crowd, such as it was, had already peeled away, disappointed that nothing had exploded. Kade shrugged off his coat. It was old, oven-warm from the press of his body, smelling faintly of engine clean and smoke. He stepped up, draped it over her shoulders, careful not to brush skin with skin. She flinched anyway, the sort of flinch that isn't about touch but about memory. Come, he said. One word. Even. Flat. She didn't answer. Her eyes tracked left, then right. The registrar smirked. Somewhere, a voice threw an ugly laugh into the humid air. Kade turned without waiting and began to walk. After a heartbeat, bare feet scuffed the deck behind him. He slowed his stride without making it obvious. They passed a pair of riggers who looked up from a crate and looked away just as fast. A broker muttered something not loud enough to be brave. Kade didn't answer anything he didn't ask. He kept the path that avoided cameras, the path that edged past Shadow and stanchion toward Dock 16. When he reached the Ardent, he didn't open the gangway by voice. He keyed in the code, the kind of habit you keep when you've known people who like to listen. Inside, the ship smelled like old metal and burnt dust and coffee that had scabbed to the bottom of a tin pot. The Ardent was a mid-century freighter with 2 conversions and 1,000 compromises. She had dents in places that told stories, and Kade kept every story quiet. He guided the woman through the short corridor into the main bay. The heat was better here. The light softer, warm enough to uncoil a little from the shoulders if you were the type who remembered how. He set a tin of water on the galley shelf, then a folded towel. He pointed to the small wash alcove where a curtain could become a wall if you needed it to. He kept his voice at that same even register that didn't require trust and didn't step on it, either. Water's clean, he said. There's soap. She stood in the middle of the bay wrapped in his coat, calf muscles trembling from the long walk in the cold. She looked at the alcove and then at him. Her lips were split and scabbed. When she spoke, her voice was rough enough to pull blood. Why? Kade had a lot of answers he didn't say. Because I've seen cages from both sides. Because I know how long a man can live with a choice he didn't make, and how much longer with one he did. Because if I walk away, I'll hear your breath in the ducts of this ship for a year. Because nobody else did, he said instead. She watched him for another beat, weighing whether that was a net or a bridge. Then she moved into the alcove, closed the curtain, and Kade heard the first careful splash of water hit skin. He turned his back, busying his hands with the medkit. Gauze. Adhesive. A little tube of neutralizing gel for stims they used on auction blocks to keep merchandise upright. He kept his face from the curtain even when the sound of water changed to a stifled breath. He looked instead at the etched bulkhead panel someone had carved a long time ago, an old hauler superstition, 2 lines crossed to make a star. He watched the star until the curtain whispered back. She had pulled his coat tight again, sleeves hanging past her hands. The worst of the blood was gone. What remained was bruising and the pale map of places fingers had gripped too hard. Up close, the faint bioluminescent web under her skin lodged a steady, sullen glow, the way some deep-sea creatures light when startled. He lifted the medkit and then paused, letting the question be visible in his hands before it was in his voice. May I? Her chin lifted a fraction. The movement shivered through her like gravity readjusting. She nodded once. He worked with the same method he used on machines he liked, slow, precise, no wasted force. Gel first, to cool the cracked places. Gauze next, to wrap the ribs without crushing them. He didn't look at her face because he didn't want her to think he was reading it for permissions she hadn't given. He read the body instead. The flinch when he hit a nerve. The little clench when tape kissed the side of an old bruise. He adjusted as he went, shifting touch to tool wherever possible. When he finished, he set the kit aside and took a breath he hadn't noticed he was holding. You can rest, he said. Bunks through there. He nodded toward the side cabin. Door locks from your side. She didn't move. What do I call you? He asked after a moment. Her eyes flickered like the lumen had jittered. She pulled the coat closer, as if the name might be hiding inside the lining. It took her a breath to find it. Elara, she said. Kade nodded once. Kade. Her mouth tried the shape of it, Kade. He turned without another question and took the pilot's chair in the bay, a tacit promise written in posture. He would stay where she could see him, he wouldn't block the way, and he would be there if the walls turned into something they weren't. Elara crossed the bay. The door to the side cabin sighed open. She stepped in, and Kade heard the faint click of the lock catch. The Ardent hummed a low, familiar song. Kade leaned his head back and watched the ceiling panel where the old hauler's star glimmered under oil and time. He hadn't planned for this, no provisions for company, no protocols for the kind of quiet that now filled the space. He should get the seals. He should undock and run for the cold lanes where the scanners were weaker and gossip went to die. He should not be tethered to a person whose existence could be argued on paper by anyone with money and a mean streak. He sat there until the ship's chronometer nicked another minute into the log. Then he rose, secured the outer hatch, checked the berth clamps, keyed in a burn window. The Ardent had been waiting. He felt it in the way the warmed lines settled when the reactor came up, in the way the thrusters whispered readiness through the frame. He didn't sleep. He watched the dock manifest scroll on the console and watched the scrolled names like a man reading an epitaph he'd rather not know. By the time the chrono winked into station night, the berth lights dimming outside the portholes, a sound broke the quiet behind him, the cabin door unlatching. Elara stood there, coat still wrapped, hair damp and combed back. She had a smallness to her now that wasn't weakness, it was calculation, conserving what strength remained. She crossed to the galley and lifted the cup he'd left, sniffed, tasted. He watched her face change at the bitterness of ship coffee. It was almost a smile, as if something in the awfulness grounded her in the ordinary. Can you ride? He heard himself ask, and realized the question belonged to an older life, horses and dirt roads and sky you could touch. He corrected. Can you travel? Elara glanced at the sealed hatch, then at him. She nodded once. Then we go at shift change, Kade said. Before the patrol cycles. She looked at the chair where he'd Saturday, you were going to leave me in there, she said, not a question, more a test. I was going to let you lock a door, he replied. A quiet beat passed. Her fingers unclenched around the cup. The biolume under her skin eased. Thank you, she said, and the words were not a debt but a marking of ground. This thing happened, and we will both remember, and neither of us will pretend it cost nothing. Kade dipped his head. Rest, he said. We'll need it. She returned to the cabin, and the click of the lock this time didn't sound like fear, it sounded like choice. Later, when the station's false night cycled low and the berth gantries groaned with the drift of the ring, Kade brought the Ardent to life. He spoke to the ship quietly out of habit, engine checks, NAV verification, thruster calibrations counted under breath. The port controls flashed a polite query, departure vector confirmed. He answered with a burn plotted through the shadow of Graven's debris field, a thread between stones and radio ghosts. The clamps released. The Ardent shivered, then glided. Neon fell away. The ring thinned to a halo. The last of Graven's hollow narrowed to a bruise on the black. Kade let the hum of the drive sit against his bones and counted his sins like landmarks in reverse. Behind him, soft steps touched deck. Elara had come to the threshold, steadying herself on the frame as the ship found its line. She looked not at him, but at the forward viewport, where stars pooled beyond the glare. Her breath left her in a measured sigh he almost didn't hear. No one cheered. No song rose. The universe did not notice. But in the quiet bridge of an old freighter, two lives shifted orbit. Kade didn't offer promises. He offered vector. It would have to be enough for now. He set the course that hugged blind corners and sensor dropouts, the sort of path navigators call bad luck and ghosts call home. The Ardent leaned into it without complaint. Behind, the ledger at Graven's kiosk refreshed to show a final sale, the registrar tallying hard coin with greedy fingers. Somewhere, a watcher in the back room logged a name and a tail number and made a note to ask questions later. Ahead, the dark waited. Kade lifted his hand to the throttles. Hold, he said to the ship, to himself, to the quiet. The Ardent answered in kind, and together they went. Chapter 2, Chains and Silence. Space has its own kind of silence. Not the peaceful hush of forests or the sleepy stillness of a town at dawn. Out here, silence is mechanical, taut, the hum of reactors muffled by bulkheads, the breathing of air scrubbers, the occasional rattle of a loose panel in vacuum. It is the silence of survival, functional and cold. For Elara, that silence felt like another kind of chain. She sat on the narrow bunk in the side cabin, Kade's coat still wrapped around her shoulders. The metal walls pressed close. A single light strip buzzed overhead. Every sound outside, the shuffle of boots on deck, the low beep of navigation instruments, reminded her she wasn't alone. And yet, she was. Completely. The man had bought her. Freed her from one cage only to place her in another. Different walls, different lock, but the same question hung in her chest, what does he want from me? Kade hadn't said. He'd barely spoken since departure, only instructions, water. Rest. Lock the door from inside if you need. He had offered her food, a ration pack that smelled faintly of beans and iron, then left her alone. No attempt to touch. No attempt to claim. Just that steady, unreadable quiet. It made her nervous. Men with power always wanted something. The ones at the auction had wanted laughter, dominance, the thrill of breaking something already broken. Others before had wanted obedience, silence, the compliance of a body treated as property. Elara had learned to read those hungers early, to sense them before they arrived. But Kade? His silence was harder to read than cruelty. Silence could be a trap. She pressed her palms together, trying to still the faint trembling in her fingers. The bioluminescent web beneath her skin flickered in irregular pulses, a genetic quirk she'd been cursed with since birth. A reminder that she didn't belong to one world or another. To humans, she was alien. To aliens, human. To traders, defective merchandise. To herself? A question unanswered. A chime at the cabin hatch startled her. She flinched, back hitting the wall, breath tight. The lock light blinked amber. Kade's voice followed, low and calm, muffled through the door. We drop out of drift in 10 minutes. You should strap in. Just that. No command. No threat. A notice. He might as well have been telling her the weather. Elara hesitated, then keyed the lock. The door slid open. Kade stood there, one hand braced on the frame, expression steady. His coat was gone now, he wore a simple hauler's shirt, sleeves rolled to scarred forearms. He didn't look at her bruises, though they were visible beneath the fabric she'd wrapped around herself. His gaze stayed level, not drifting lower, not lingering. That unsettled her most of all. Her voice cracked, dry as static. She swallowed. Where are we going? Safe route, he said simply. Out past the debris fields. Fuel's cheap there. Not an answer, not really. But not a lie, either. Elara's throat worked. She wanted to ask the real question, what do you want from me, but the words caught like broken glass in her mouth. Instead, she nodded. Kade stepped aside, leaving the passage clear. A gesture of space, an unspoken choice. Elara wrapped the coat tighter and followed him into the narrow corridor toward the bridge. The pilot's chair fit Kade like it had been molded for him. He moved with easy precision, fingers on switches, eyes on star charts projected across the forward screen. Outside, stars blurred, stretched thin by the distortions of drift drive. The Ardent groaned with each minor correction, as if reluctant but loyal. Elara strapped herself into the co-pilot seat. The belt smelled of old leather and dust. Her hands shook slightly as she tightened them. Kade said nothing. His presence filled the space without pressing on her. Minutes passed. Drift lines bent, then snapped. The ship shuddered as real space took hold again. Outside, the stars returned to sharp points. A field of shattered rock sprawled ahead, lit by the distant sun like shards of glass in ink. Kade adjusted thrusters, weaving the ship into the shadows of asteroid hulks. Elara risked a glance at him. His profile was cut in a glow of instrument light, jaw firm, eyes steady, a face that seemed carved by too many storms weathered alone. Not young, not old. Somewhere in between. He didn't look like a rescuer. He didn't look like a buyer, either. Just, tired. Her lips parted before she could stop herself. Why didn't you touch me? The words came brittle, almost defiant. She needed to know. Needed the shape of his hunger before it consumed her. Kade's hands paused on the console. He didn't look at her immediately. When he did, his gaze was heavy but not sharp. More like a weight set down on a table between them. Because no one should have, he said simply. Silence expanded after that, but it was different this time. Not the silence of chains. Not entirely. Something had shifted, almost imperceptible, like a door cracked open a fraction. Elara turned her face toward the viewport, watching asteroid shadows drift. Her chest ached, but not with fear. With something older, buried, aching to surface. She whispered, barely audible. Elara. My name is Elara. Kade nodded once, as if recording it to memory. Kade. The Ardent glided through darkness, two strangers seated side by side, the silence between them slowly, cautiously, beginning to change. Chapter 3, The Long Ride West. The sun had started its slow descent, casting long streaks of amber light across the hard-packed trail. Dust rose behind Jonas's horse in lazy curls as the two riders pressed westward, Clara leaning against the saddle horn, swaying with each movement of the mare. She hadn't spoken in hours, but her silence wasn't void. It was filled with effort, Every breath weighed heavy against her bruised ribs, every jolt of the horse a reminder of pain she hadn't yet escaped. Jonas kept his eyes forward, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting near the worn leather of his holster. He wasn't a man given to chatter. Words came rarely, and only when they meant something. Yet in the rhythm of the ride, he found himself listening, not to Clara's silence, but to the faint sound of her holding on. Each time she steadied herself in the saddle, it told him more than any confession could. She wasn't broken. Not yet. They crested a low ridge. Below, the valley stretched out, miles of pale grass and clusters of mesquite. In the distance, his cabin sat small and near forgotten, as if the land itself had nearly swallowed it whole. To Jonas, it was nothing more than shelter, four walls, a roof that mostly held, a hearth that still burned. But tonight, for the first time, it would hold more than one soul. Clara stirred when the cabin came into view. Her lips parted slightly, a breath catching as though she'd seen something she couldn't place. Maybe relief. Maybe fear. Jonas couldn't tell. When they reached the clearing, he swung down first. He turned, offering his hand. For a heartbeat she hesitated, then took it. Her fingers were cool, trembling faint against his calloused palm. He didn't squeeze, only steadied her as she slid down from the saddle. She stood barefoot on the dry earth, his coat still wrapped tight around her shoulders. The cabin door groaned when he pushed it open. Inside smelled of leather, pine smoke, and long years of solitude. He set a tin cup on the table, filled it with water, and left it within her reach. She stood at the threshold, gaze flickering across the small space, caught in the corner, table, chair, hearth. Nothing more. Sit, he said simply. She did, lowering herself into the chair with care, the coat bunched against her chest. Jonas moved with a steady rhythm, unsaddling the horse, stacking kindling, striking a match against the hearthstone. The fire caught, spilling warmth and light across the room. Clara's eyes followed each motion. Not with suspicion, at least, not only that, but with a wary curiosity. For so long, every man who approached had carried expectation. Jonas carried none. That absence was its own kind of weight. When he finally sat across from her, the silence thickened. The crackle of the fire filled the space between them. Her hands wrapped around the cup, knuckles pale, but she didn't drink. She just held it, grounding herself. Jonas leaned back, resting his forearms on his knees. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He didn't even tell her his name. He only stayed there, quiet, steady, a presence that neither pressed nor withdrew. For the first time since the platform in Gaines Hollow, Clara felt the edges of something she hadn't dared to imagine. Not safety, not yet. But the shape of it. And in the hush of that evening, the two of them, one man haunted, one woman scarred, breathed the same air, as if the world had allowed a fragile beginning. Chapter 4, Scars Beneath the Skin. The hum of the Ardent was steady again, like a heartbeat Elara was learning to lean into. She had begun to trace its rhythms the way a ship hand might trace a coastline, knowing where it rose, where it dipped, where it cracked into whispers when coolant lines shifted with the cold. Each vibration through the metal hull became a language she was slowly beginning to understand. But her body spoke a different language, one harder to translate. The bruises had started to yellow. The raw cuts on her wrists, where binding had bitten deeper than skin should endure, were scabbing, then itching. Her ribs still flared with pain when she reached too far or laughed too suddenly. She had no mirror, but she could feel the map of herself, discoloration like storm clouds over bone, hair tangled and broken, a weight in her shoulders that no ration meal could lift. Kade noticed, though he never said. He noticed in the way he adjusted the ship's grav dampeners a fraction lighter, so the pressure eased on her bones. He noticed when he pulled a medkit from under the cot and set it beside her without instructions, just waiting until she unlatched it herself. Inside, salve, bandage rolls, a tiny injector with a half-used vial labeled in a language she could not read. Elara hesitated. She had known medicine used for subduing as much as for healing. Kade crouched near, not reaching for her. Pain duller, he said simply, tapping the vial. Won't take your edge. Won't keep you asleep. She studied him, searching for a shadow of lie. His face was unreadable, carved lines of someone who had lost more than he'd claimed. Still, his eyes held steady. She pressed the injector to her side, flinched at the hiss, then exhaled when warmth spread beneath her skin like slow fire thawing frost. For the first time in months, years, maybe, her body wasn't just surviving. It was easing. That night, she didn't retreat to the side cabin. Instead, she curled in the corner of the galley, blanket wrapped close, watching the fire sim glow on the panel. It was a poor imitation of flame, just a projection looped through pixels. But it cracked faintly, a sound file to soothe. She had never seen real fire, not the kind that breathed and spat sparks. Yet something in the image calmed her. Kade sat across the small table, sharpening a blade that had no business being as clean as it was. Sparks of light glanced off the edge, each scrape slow and deliberate. Elara's eyes traced the knife. "Do you ever get tired of carrying weapons?" she asked quietly. Kade paused, looked up. "Do you ever get tired of needing them?" Her lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Fair." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Not brittle. Not empty. It held the weight of unasked questions, hers and his. She shifted, pulling the blanket tighter. The words came unbidden. "They used to tell me I was lucky," she murmured. "That being sold meant I was worth something. Worth keeping alive." Her fingers knotted in the blanket. "But when no one bids?" Her voice broke. The memory of the auction platform, the eyes of men measuring her value in coin and cruelty, pressed too sharp against her chest. Kade set the knife down, the scrape of metal against wood soft but firm. He didn't speak immediately. "Then, their worth is measured wrong." Elara blinked at him, confusion flickering with the firelight on her face. "People who think lives can be tallied in coin," Kade said slowly, "they spend themselves empty and don't even see it." He leaned back, arms crossing over his chest. "I've seen men buy a whole planet's silence and still sleep with ghosts louder than cannon fire." She studied him. "You sound like you've known those men." His jaw tightened. He looked past her, eyes fixed on some memory anchored far away. "I was one of them. Not buying, but taking orders from those who did. Thought discipline was duty. Thought survival was obedience." He didn't elaborate, but the edges of his words were jagged with something old. Elara let the silence stretch, filling it not with pity but with presence. At last, she whispered, "And now?" Kade's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "Now I keep breathing, one day at a time, and try to make sure someone else can too." Her throat burned. She looked down, tracing her fingers across the blanket. It was not a promise of safety. But it was the closest thing she'd ever been given. Days blurred. Elara began helping in small ways, sorting parts, cleaning filters, learning which levers required a steady hand and which could be coaxed with patience. Her hands shook at first, but steadied with practice. Each success, however small, stitched a thread back into her. One evening, while tightening a coupling, she brushed her sleeve up too far. Kade's eyes flicked to the pale lattice beneath her skin, lines that pulsed faintly, alien bioluminescence woven into her veins. She froze, sleeve half pulled, breath caught. "Ugly," she whispered. "No," Kade said firmly, without hesitation. "Different." She looked at him sharply, expecting mockery or dismissal. His face was calm, as if he were remarking on a star's color, or the sound of a river. A fact, not a flaw. Tears stung her eyes, unbidden. She turned away before he could see them fall. But she felt something shift inside, the smallest fracture in the wall she had built, letting in the faintest warmth. Later that night, alone in the galley, Elara stared at her reflection in the viewport glass. The stars burned around her face, the faint glow in her veins painting her skin with threads of light. She touched her wrist where the scars had nearly healed. For the first time, she did not see only filth and ruin. She saw survival etched in skin. And maybe, just maybe, something that could be more. Behind her, she heard the faint creak of Kade's chair in the bridge. His presence was no longer a weight pressing on her. It was a steady gravity, something that held her in place while the galaxy turned. And for Elara, scars and all, that was enough to begin. Chapter 5, Raiders in the Dark. The Ardent cut through silence, its engines purring low as the stars wheeled like frozen fire around them. For weeks, the ship had been cocoon, safe, steady, womb of metal carrying Elara away from the auction block in the hands that had claimed her as spoil. But safety in the outer rim never lasted. Not for long. It began with a flicker on the NAV screen. A pulse too sharp, too patterned to be random static. Kade frowned at the display, jaw tightening. His hands moved over the console with a swiftness that made Elara's chest tighten. She had learned that silence from him. When he grew still, danger was near. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "Beacon. Raiders." Masked as distress. Her stomach dropped. She'd heard stories, half-whispered rumors of scavenger clans who prowled trade lanes, baiting ships with false signals before stripping them down to metal and blood. "Can we go around?" "Not fast enough." His voice was flat, measuring. "They've already seen us." Almost on cue, the ship shuddered. Warning lights flared. Elara clutched the back of his chair as alarms screamed through the cockpit. On the viewport, 3 smaller vessels slid from the dark like wolves circling prey, lean, jagged crafts, paint flaking, gunports glowing faint red. "They'll board us," Kade muttered. His hands flicked switches, locking down bulkheads. Too small for a straight fight. "They'll try to hook lines." Elara's breath came shallow. Her mind raced with old terror, being grabbed, dragged, voices jeering, skin burned with the press of chains. Kade must have seen it in her face. He turned briefly, eyes hard, steady. "Listen to me. If they breach, you don't hide. You stay behind me. Understand?" Her lips parted. "What if?" "Understand." His voice was iron. She swallowed. Nodded. The ship rocked again, metal groaning as magnetic clamps bit into the hull. The sound vibrated down her bones. Kade rose, slinging a rifle from its rack near the door. He checked the chamber, motion smooth, practiced. Then he glanced at her. "Stay close." The corridor lights dimmed. Boots on metal echoed from the airlock. A hiss, a thud, the sound of cutting torches. Elara pressed her back against the bulkhead, blanket clutched like a useless shield. Kade stood firm, rifle leveled. The airlock blew open with a scream of steel. Smoke curled. 3 figures stormed through, armor pieced together from scrap, faces hidden behind crude visors. Their weapons gleamed dull in the half-light. "Easy haul," one jeered, voice tinny through the mask. "Didn't think the ghost captain kept pets." Elara froze. The word slammed into her chest, pet. Just like before. Kade didn't flinch. "Step back out," he said, tone cold as vacuum. The raiders laughed. One leveled a blade. Another raised a shock rifle. And then everything moved at once. Kade fired, sharp, thunderous, the muzzle flash searing the dark. The first raider fell, armor sparking, chest crumpled. The others roared, surged forward. Kade shifted, precise, his movements like carved stone, no hesitation, no wasted breath. Elara couldn't breathe. The corridor spun with sound, shots, shouts, the screech of boots. One raider lunged past Kade, arm reaching for her. The stink of oil and sweat filled her nose. Her body reacted before thought. Her hand shot out, grabbed the wrench she'd been using earlier to tighten couplings. She swung. The crack rang through her bones. The raider staggered, helmet splitting. His eyes, bloodshot, furious, met hers before Kade's second shot dropped him. Elara gasped, heart racing so hard it burned. The wrench slipped from her fingers, clanging against the floor. She stumbled back, pressing against the wall. The last raider cursed, retreating half a step. His visor snapped toward her, then toward Kade. He lifted his weapon. No. Elara's voice tore out raw. Kade pivoted, faster than she thought possible. The shot echoed. Silence followed. The final raider collapsed in a heap. Smoke thickened in the air, the tang of ozone and metal sharp in Elara's throat. For a long heartbeat, she couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Her hands shook violently, streaked with grime and blood not her own. Kade lowered his rifle, scanning the bodies. He kicked one weapon aside, then finally turned to her. His face was stone, but his eyes softened just barely. "You did what you had to," he said. Elara shook her head. Her voice broke. I didn't mean. You lived." His tone brooked no argument. He stepped closer, careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. "And you chose not to hide." Her knees buckled. She slid down the wall, trembling. The memory of the wrench striking bone reverberated in her arm. She wanted to retch, to scrub her skin raw. But under the horror, another current pulsed, hot, undeniable. She had not frozen. She had fought. And for the first time, the terror of being powerless cracked. Kade crouched in front of her, rifle resting against his shoulder. His voice was low. "They'll come again. Others always do. But if you want to stand with me, then you'll learn how. Not just to swing a wrench." Her breath caught. She lifted her eyes to his. He wasn't offering comfort. He was offering choice. Slowly, her shaking hand closed into a fist. "Teach me," she whispered. For the first time, Kade's mouth curved, half smile, fleeting but real. "Good." The bodies were stripped of weapons, then dragged to the airlock and cast into the void. Elara watched from a distance, the stars swallowing them without ceremony. Her stomach still twisted, but her hands no longer shook. Later, as the Ardent drifted back into quiet, Elara sat at the galley table, staring at her palms. Bruised, bloodied, but steady. Kade set a cup of water in front of her. She looked up, searching his face. "Do you kill easily?" she asked. His gaze met hers, flat. "No. But I kill when it's the only way to keep breathing." She held his eyes, then nodded. She understood now. Not in theory, but in blood. When she finally lay down to sleep, she did not curl small. Her body stretched, ribs aching, arms open. She dreamed not of chains or platforms, but of stars rushing past as a rifle fired steady beside her. And when she woke, she knew, her life was no longer only about survival. It was about choosing who she would stand with when the dark came again. Chapter 6, Ashes of the Past. The Ardent drifted along a forgotten trade route, its engines muted to whispers as Kade adjusted course by instinct more than chart. Out here, stars burned in endless silence, each one a lighthouse that never moved. To Elara, they seemed like watchful eyes, cold, ancient, unwilling to intervene. She had begun to learn the rhythm of travel, the thrum of the reactor at half output, the ritual of checking seals, the quiet meals shared at the galley rail. She no longer flinched at every sound. Her body was healing, her mind threading itself back together. But safety is fragile. It lasts only until something stronger remembers your name. It was Elara who saw the ship first. A shadow on the long-range scan, moving against the flow of the drift. Small, fast, with a heat signature that carried hunger. "Kade," she said, her voice tight. He leaned over her shoulder, eyes narrowing at the screen. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "It's not random." The way he said it chilled her. The vessel drew closer, its trajectory deliberate, its silence louder than any hail. When its engines flared, the symbol stenciled across its hull caught the light, a black sun split by a jagged blade. Elara didn't know it, but Kade did. His hand tightened on the console until the knuckles whitened. "Who are they?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "Ash blades. Privateers turned mercenaries. Used to work the frontier." He cut himself off, jaw hard. "I know them." The comm crackled. A voice, slick and venomous, slid through the speakers. Well. If it isn't the ghost himself." Elara stiffened. She looked at Kade, who had gone utterly still, eyes fixed on the viewport. "Captain Hale," the voice drawled. "Or should I call you deserter now?" Her heart slammed in her chest. Deserter. The word lodged sharp in her ribs. Kade's reply was low, steady. "You should call me nothing, Rin." A laugh filled the cabin, harsh as static. "You cost us a fortune when you walked away. Do you think the blades forget debt?" "No, old friend. We just wait until it burns brighter." Elara's eyes darted between them. Kade hadn't told her much of his past, just fragments. Duty. Obedience. Ghosts. But now the shape of it sharpened in front of her. He hadn't simply wandered into solitude. He had fled. And the past had followed. A warning shot flashed across their bow. The Ardent shuddered under the shockwave. Rin's voice returned, cold. "You've got something we want." "The girl. Hand her over, and maybe we let you keep your bones." Elara's blood froze. She pressed back against the chair, hands gripping the armrests until her nails dug grooves into the fabric. Her skin prickled as if the chains were already snapping shut again. But Kade's voice was iron. "She's not yours." Rin laughed again. "That's what you always said, wasn't it? That nothing was yours to take. But you took lives anyway, didn't you? Tell me, Ghost, does she know? Does she know the blood that coats those steady hands?" Elara turned to him, heart pounding. He didn't look at her. His gaze was locked on the void ahead, where the Black Sun ship prowled closer. The fight came fast. Grapplers launched, clawing at the Ardent's hull. Kade threw the ship into a roll, the gravity shifting beneath their feet. Elara's stomach lurched, but she held tight as sparks showered from a vent. The ash blades fired, tearing through shielding. Kade cursed, punching in counter-thrusts. The Ardent was nimble, but old. Each hit rattled her bones, each warning light screamed louder. "Can we outrun them?" Elara shouted. "Not in a straight line." His voice was clipped, controlled. "We need cover." He yanked the ship hard toward a debris field, twisted remains of an old mining station, jagged metal bones spinning slowly through the void. It was dangerous, a graveyard that had swallowed ships before. But it was better than being stripped alive. The Ardent weaved between wreckage. Shattered girders scraped past the viewport, close enough Elara could almost touch them. The ash blade ship followed, hounding like a wolf. Kade pulled hard on the controls, threading the needle between two drifting pylons. The enemy clipped one, sparks blooming across its hull. Still, it pressed on. Elara's breath came shallow, her pulse drumming in her ears. She had faced raiders already, but this was different. This was personal. She risked a glance at Kade. His face was stone, but sweat traced his temple. His eyes, dark, hollow, were not the eyes of the man who had handed her a comb, or sat silent by the fire sim. They were the eyes of someone dragged back into a war he thought he'd buried. And yet he flew like the ship was part of him, like every turn of the debris had been drawn on his bones long ago. The comm crackled again. Rin's voice was a knife. "Run, Ghost, run. You always were good at running." Something inside Elara snapped. Fear twisted into anger, sharp and clean. She leaned forward, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He's not running. He's keeping me safe. And that's something you'll never understand." The silence on the line stretched, taut. Then came Rin's low chuckle. "So she speaks. How quaint. Don't worry, little starling. We'll teach you when to keep quiet." Elara's throat tightened, but she held her ground. The battle dragged on. The Ardent's shields were failing, hull groaning. Kade's hands never faltered, but Elara could see the weight in his shoulders. She realized, with sudden clarity, that if they survived, it wouldn't be because of fate. It would be because Kade refused to stop. And because she refused to go back. Her eyes darted to the weapons panel. Weeks ago, she would never have dared. But now, after the wrench, after the raiders, she knew choice mattered more than fear. "Tell me what to do," she said. Kade flicked his gaze to her, shock flashing quick in his eyes. She met it head on. "Tell me." For a moment, he hesitated. Then he nodded, sharp. "Gunnery. Port side. Target their clamps." Her body shook as she slid into the chair, hands trembling over the controls. The targeting screen blinked alive, crosshairs dancing across the enemy hull. She forced her breath steady, forced her hand to still. When the lock buzzed green, she fired. The recoil jolted through the Ardent. On the screen, one of the Raiders' grapplers exploded, spinning off into the void. Elara gasped, half in shock, half in disbelief. She had done it. Kade's voice was firm, low. "Again." She did. The second clamp burst. Sparks scattered like dying stars. The Raider ship wavered, momentum faltering. Kade seized the moment, slamming the Ardent into a dive that peeled them away. Debris swallowed them, the enemy's sensors blinded by the wreckage. Minutes later, silence returned. The Ardent drifted free, scarred but alive. Elara sagged back in the chair, chest heaving. Her hands still shook, but with something different now. Not helplessness. Not fear. Something harder. Something earned. Kade powered down the weapons, setting the ship back to idle. He leaned against the console, head bowed, shoulders heavy. For the first time, Elara saw him not as the ghostly savior who had pulled her from chains, but as a man carrying scars that no medkit could mend. "You knew them," she said softly. He didn't lift his head. "I was one of them. Not the worst. Never the worst. But I flew their flag. Fired their guns. And when I saw what we became, I ran." His voice cracked, low. "I left people behind. People who didn't get the chance." Elara swallowed. The image of him as a raider warred with the man who had handed her water, who had shielded her from harm. But the truth didn't undo what he had done for her. Slowly, she reached across the console. Her hand hovered, then rested gently on his. "You're not them anymore," she said. "You chose different." His eyes finally lifted to hers. Haunted. But in the dark of them, a flicker of something else, a light not yet extinguished. And in that fragile moment, amid the ashes of the past, Elara realized, survival was no longer enough. She wanted to fight for something more. For him. For them both. Chapter 7, The Horizon of Choice. The Ardent drifted in silence for hours after the battle, her hull scarred, systems humming with fatigue. Patches of scorched metal still smoked faintly where impacts had bitten deep. The ship had survived, but barely. Elara stood by the viewport, hands pressed against the cold glass, staring into the ocean of stars. They stretched forever, each one a promise and a prison. The thought gnawed at her: if they kept running, there would always be another ship, another hunter, another ghost from Kade's past, or hers. Her reflection in the glass startled her. Bruises fading, hair combed, but eyes, sharper now. Alive. Not the hollow-eyed girl who had clung to a filthy blanket under the auction lights. She had wielded a weapon, made a choice, saved them both. And yet, the fear still lingered: what if survival was all they would ever have? Behind her, the hiss of hydraulics signaled Kade sealing another bulkhead. He worked like a man possessed, every movement economical, precise, but heavy with thought. His silence wasn't the old, distant kind. It was a silence thick with decisions he hadn't spoken yet. Finally, he set the tools down and looked at her. His voice was rough. "We can't keep this up." Elara turned. "Running?" He nodded once. "Every time I think we've left them behind, the past catches our wake. Raiders. The Blades. Others. They'll keep coming. Not just for me anymore, for you." The words landed like iron. She knew he was right. "So what do we do?" she asked. His jaw tightened. He leaned against the bulkhead, arms folded. "Options. We keep running, far beyond the drift lanes. Hide in the deep void. It's safer, but it's not living. And the other option?" He hesitated. The silence stretched until she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, we stand. Find the Blades. End it." Elara's breath caught. The idea was madness. They were two people on a battered hauler, facing a mercenary faction with ships, soldiers, resources. And yet, her heart surged at the thought. Because it was more than madness. It was freedom. "They'll kill us," she whispered. "Maybe," Kade said. His eyes were steady, dark as the void but unflinching. "But running will kill us slower. Piece by piece." Elara's hands curled into fists. She remembered the wrench in her grip, the recoil of the turret, the way her blood had thundered not with fear but with choice. For so long, her life had been dictated by others, masters, raiders, fate. But here, now, she had a voice. "I don't want to live in cages anymore," she said, voice trembling but clear. "Not theirs. Not the stars. Not even the cage of running." Kade studied her, something raw flickering in his eyes. "Then you're choosing to fight?" She nodded. "With you." The decision changed everything. Preparation began that night. Kade pulled old schematics from the ship's databanks, layouts of stations the Blades once used, routes they favored, weaknesses in their hunting patterns. His memory filled the gaps, painting a picture of the predator's den. Elara sat with him at the galley table, maps spread across the surface, stars glowing in hollow blue. Her fingers traced the routes, mind sharp. She asked questions he hadn't expected, spotted details he'd overlooked, blind spots in patrols, fuel choke points, places where a small ship could slip in unnoticed. "You're quick," he said after her third correction. She smirked faintly. "Survival makes you quick." Then, softer, "And I've been watching you." Kade didn't reply, but a flicker of pride crossed his face. Training followed. In the cargo bay, Kade laid out weapons: rifle, sidearm, blade. He showed her how to hold them, how to breathe with the trigger, how to aim not at the target but at the moment before the target moved. At first, Elara's hands shook. Her shots scattered, wild. She cursed under her breath, frustrated. Kade stepped behind her, his presence steady but careful, his voice low. "Don't fight the fear. Use it. Let it sharpen you." She tried again. The blast rang clean. The bolt struck closer to center. Her chest swelled. Again. closer still. By the end of the session, sweat streaked her brow, but her eyes burned with focus. For the first time, she didn't feel like prey learning to bite back. She felt like a fighter in her own right. One night, after hours of drills, Elara sat by the viewport again, watching the stars drift. Kade joined her, lowering himself into the chair beside her with a weary grunt. They sat in silence, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. She spoke first, voice quiet. "When you said you were one of them, the Blades. Did you believe in it?" He was slow to answer. "I believed in belonging. In purpose. I thought following orders made me less guilty. That if I didn't decide who bled, it wasn't my fault." He exhaled, long and ragged. "It took me too long to see that obedience is just another word for cowardice." Elara turned to him. His face was shadowed, the lines of regret carved deep. But she didn't see only guilt. She saw the man who had carried her from chains, who had faced raiders and ghosts alike, who had chosen, over and over, not to abandon her. "You're not that man anymore," she said firmly. He met her gaze. For once, he didn't argue. Days later, the plan was set. A rendezvous point, a trap, a fight not for survival alone but for an ending. The Ardent would never match the Blades ship for ship, but Kade's knowledge and Elara's resolve gave them something sharper than firepower, intent. As they sat in the cockpit, finalizing the course, Elara reached for the controls before he could. She punched in the coordinates herself, steady hands guiding the ship's path. Kade arched a brow. "You're sure?" She looked at him, eyes fierce, voice steady. "We're done running." For the first time since she had spoken her name aloud, Kade smiled, not faint, not fleeting, but full, raw, alive. "Then let's end this," he said. As the Ardent surged into drift, stars bending into streaks of light, Elara felt the weight of her choice settle deep in her chest. Fear still lingered, sharp and cold, but it was different now. It was the fear of stepping onto a horizon unknown, not of chains tightening around her wrists. She whispered into the hum of the ship, not sure if it was to herself, to Kade, or to the stars, "We fight." And for the first time, the word tasted like freedom. Chapter 8, Stars Will Remember. They chose the battlefield themselves. Not a crowded port with laws that could be bought, not open drift where a bigger ship would simply grind them down. Kade plotted a course to Yarrow Station, an abandoned or hub left to tumble around a dim red dwarf. The station was a spine of rusted trusses and hollow tanks, its skin peeled back by time, its interior riddled with vacuum and shadow, perfect ground for a smaller vessel that knew how to disappear. Elara studied the schematic Kade projected on the galley table. The station's central ring had snapped years ago, only 3 spokes connected the surviving hub to outer tanks. "We choke them here," Kade said, tapping the narrowest corridor on a spoke. "Force them to come single file. They'll think our ship is limping to hide. We'll make them commit." "And the exit?" Elara asked. Kade's finger traced a line along a maintenance duct. "Pressure safe all the way to the outer hull. If it goes bad, we vent the ring and slip out along the truss while their ship is still docked." Elara nodded. She didn't ask what "goes bad" meant. The universe had taught her the definition. They worked through the night. Kade prepped 2 EMP pedals, flat discs the size of palms that unfolded into flowered spirals tuned to burn sensor arrays and short-range comms. Elara rigged decoy beacons inside Yarrow's skeleton so the station would hum like a nest of life instead of a grave. They rehearsed movement hand signals until their fingers obeyed without thought. When Kade handed her the compact sidearm they'd tuned together, Elara didn't flinch at the weight. It felt like ownership, not burden. Dawn didn't exist in space, but habit measured time anyway. When they slipped into Yarrow's shadow, the Ardent looked wounded, by design. Scorch scored the hull in real patterns from real fights, and Kade spoofed their transponder to cough distress on a narrow band the ash blades like to comb. "They'll come," Kade said, throttling the ship into the broken ring. Rin likes finishing his myths. Elara tightened the harness across her chest and watched the dark beyond the viewport. Fear sat in her, yes, but it had a shape she recognized now. It made her precise. The blades answered like a prophecy. One ship, then two, angling in with predatory patience. The lead wore the black sun and jagged blade sigil, fresh paint over older scars. Rin's voice hissed across the band with faux warmth. Ghost. You chose a mausoleum. How fitting. Kade cut the channel without reply and let his ship drift deeper into Yarrow's ribs. The blades followed, scanners raking the dark. Elara triggered the first decoy. Life signs flickered in empty compartments. The enemy ship corrected course, hungry for ghosts that weren't there. EMP pedal, now, Kade said. Elara's thumb brushed the activator. Somewhere in the station's bones, a folded coil bloomed, and the air shivered with invisible lightning. On their screen, the blade sensor bloom stuttered, went wide and stupid for 2 heartbeats, enough. Kade kicked the Ardent sideways into a service bay, killed her signature, and locked her to a corroded docking ring with manual clamps the universe had forgotten. They'll have to come see, he said. They did. Mag lines bit metal. An umbilical latched. A hatch screamed. Kade and Elara were already in the spoke corridor, lights off, magnets clicked in their boots, backs to opposite walls. Elara's breath condensed and vanished in the cold. She could hear her own heartbeat, and Kade's silence beside it, not calm but contained. The first blade stepped through, visor shining the pallid blue of a helmet HUD. Elara didn't think about what the suit hid. She thought about angles. She fired once. The bolt took the visor, and the head snapped back into dark. The second raider shoved the body aside and charged. Kade's rifle answered with the flat punctuation of practiced war. 2 down. The third ducked, fired blind, bolts carving bright scars where Elara's shoulder had been a second before. Kade's hand sliced a signal, left, low, now. Elara dropped to a knee and shot the cable above the raider's head. The line snapped, a heavy cable sluice folder whipping downward with the merciless logic of physics. Armor crunched. Silence swallowed the scream. More boots. Elara felt the corridor narrowing with each inhale, tighter, louder, closer. She tossed the second EMP pedal past Kade's shoulder. It clattered behind the advancing raiders and unfurled in a sudden halo, HUD's blue static white. Shouts flooded the dark. They moved. Calm, efficient. Kade's rifle wrote the order of the corridor in brief sentences. Elara's sidearm underlined them. When the last helmet rolled quiet, when the only sound was her ragged breath and the quiet tick of cooling metal, she realized her hands weren't shaking. Kade touched her elbow. You good? His hand signal carried a question and a promise. Elara nodded. Good. A slow clap echoed down the spoke. Rin stepped into view without a helmet, face bare, smile carved deep and wrong. He walked like a man who believed the room belonged to him. Behind him, 2 more raiders, heavier armor, weapons leveled. Rin held nothing but a small shape pinched between fingers. Charming tricks, he said, glancing at the dead. New pets got teeth. I see why you ran, Kade, you always did love a stray. Kade didn't answer. The muzzle of his rifle did all the talking it needed to. Rin lifted the thing in his hand, a remote, and sked. You want to gamble? The station still got pressure pockets. I've wired one to go. You and the girl can bleed slow together if you fire before I walk away. Elara's skin prickled. She'd mapped the pressure pockets, she knew which ones could kill them here, which ones could shear a ship in half. She ran calculations faster than fear. Rin wanted them hesitant, pinned by mercy. Kade's voice was flat. You won't blow your own men. Rin's grin widened. Sweet of you to think I came to save anyone. Elara saw it then, the hairline crack in Rin's plan, the way his feet were set, the line of sight he assumed. Pressure safety doors, old, manual, sat hidden in the shadows of the cross-join. Kade hadn't had time to mention them, but Yero's bones had spoken to her when she studied the schematic at 0300, the way abandoned things speak to those who have been abandoned. Her hand flicked, door, 2, manual, now. Kade's eyes cut to where she pointed. A fraction of a nod. Rin took a step forward, casual, remote poised. His lieutenants steadied their barrels. Elara moved first. She snapped fire at the left lieutenant, not to kill but to force the flinch. Kade pivoted, 3 silent strides, a kick, a wrench, his palm found the manual lever and dropped the pressure door like a guillotine between them and the detonator. Metal slammed, the sound a cathedral bell in the bones. Rin's grin vanished beneath the echo. He pressed the remote anyway. Somewhere deeper in Yero, a muffled blast thumped, wrong compartment, wrong reach. Air howled through a far duct. The station shuddered but held. Kade fired through the hatch's small viewport. Glass crazed, then burst. The second lieutenant went down. Rin dove for cover, cursing, remote rattling away into the dark. Elara surged forward, boots skittering on frost, breath a white banner. She hit the adjoining service panel, ripped it off, and plunged her hand into the tangle the way Kade had taught her to trust both instinct and physics. Cut power. Kill the umbilical. Sparks kissed her knuckles. The dock clamps on the blade's ship twitched, whined, loosened. Now, she shouted. Kade slammed the emergency vent control. Air turned into fists. The corridor howled. Loose casings, dust, a dropped rifle all ripped toward the newly open mouth of space. Rin clawed for a rung, boots screaming against metal. Kade seized the rail with one hand, flung his rifle with the other. It struck Rin's temple. Blood rose like a dark flower and evaporated in the vacuum. Rin's grip slipped. Elara locked her arm around a stanchion, teeth bared against the drag, eyes never leaving the man who had hunted their lives like sport. He spun once in the gale, eyes meeting hers through the chaos, surprise there, and rage, and the smallest kernel of something like grief for the story he'd never get to be the hero in. Then the void took him, clean and final. The blade's ship, half-clamped and hurt, sheared away, slammed into a spinning truss, and began its slow, terminal drift. Silence fell. Not peace, vacuum. Elara's ears rang with the echo of her own blood. Kade slapped the vent control closed. The hatch ground down. Emergency pumps coughed air back into the corridor, thin as paper at first, then thicker, then enough to let lungs remember how to work. They didn't speak for a long 30 seconds. Then Kade leaned his forehead against the cold wall and laughed once, a short, astonished sound a man makes when he finds himself alive by his own hand in someone else's courage. Elara leaned beside him, chest heaving, hair weightless for a breath before the gravity settled back. Her hands were nicked and blackened, her throat raw, her eyes bright. "We ended it," she whispered. Kade looked at her, and in the hollow places of his face something lit. Not triumph, something steadier. Relief. Respect. A future that wasn't just the absence of pursuit. "We ended it," he agreed. They moved like people who had just learned the value of slowness. Bodies checked. Air confirmed. Weapons cleared. They walked the corridor together, stepping over the debris of a story that would not continue. In the service bay, the Ardent waited, patient as always. Kade's palm smoothed her scarred hull like a thank you. They undocked without ceremony. Yero's broken ring fell behind them, a rusted halo around a faint star. No signal followed. No threat. The band stayed clean as a new page. On the bridge, Elara took the co-pilot chair without asking. Kade didn't correct her. He handed over the chart stylus. She drew a line, not to the deep void, not to the nearest buyer's market, but to a green system Kade had once mentioned like a rumor you don't dare want, a frontier colony with more sky than laws and more work than questions. He watched her hand, then her face. You sure? Elara turned to the viewport. Stars burned like 1,000 small promises. The faint glow in her veins traced her wrist where it rested on the console, not a mark of ownership, but a map of having survived. I'm done being cargo, she said. Let's go build something that remembers us kindly. Kade's mouth turned in that rare, full, unguarded smile that made him look younger by 10 hard years. He set the throttle forward. The Ardent leapt. Outside, light smeared into river lines. Inside, the cabin held steady. Elara let her head fall back and closed her eyes. For the first time since the auction, since the platform and the filthy blanket and the laughter that had wanted her to be less than human, she allowed the idea of tomorrow to sit in her chest without burning. The stars would remember the ash blades as wreckage. They would remember Yarrow's last howl, Rin's final reach, the way vacuum makes the universe honest. But if stars remember anything at all, Elara hoped they would remember this: a small ship, an old regret, a new vow, and two people who chose the hardest thing, to stop running and turn toward a life. They flew into it together. If this journey moved you, if you felt the hum of the Ardent, the grit of Yarrow's metal, the moment a choice became freedom, come ride with us again. Subscribe to Sci-Fi Nebula for more human hearts set against impossible skies. Out here, we don't promise happy endings. We promise true ones.